Good evening to our viewers in Germany and hello to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Kaffeepause. In our Kaffeepause series, we regularly check in with Berlin-based journalists to talk about emerging stories and breaking news. And I actually just landed in Berlin this afternoon and am still trying to hone in on all of the news of the past 24 hours or so. But I am joined by Stephan Detjen, who has his finger on the pulse of what is going on in Berlin and in Germany. He is chief correspondent for Deutschlandradio and he heads the station's capital city studio in Berlin. So many of our viewers will be familiar with his voice from the radio. Stefan, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you, Stephen. It's good to be back with the American Council on Germany. Of course, it was a delight to be with you in New York in December. And I'd rather prefer that. I prefer to be in a Kaffeepause, even though in Germany we might also be in a good time for the first gin tonic of the evening.
Exactly. This could almost be a happy hour instead of a Kaffeepause today. I mean, of course, you were able to spend several months in the US and measure the pulse of what was going on in the US, but it feels like no sooner had you come back to Germany than Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced that he was making a Blitzbesuch to Washington, D.C. to meet with US President Joe Biden, and you were able to accompany him on that visit. In addition to seeing the president, Olaf Scholz had meetings with business leaders and with members of Congress, and the top item on Scholz's agenda was financial support for Ukraine. I'm really happy to talk with you, Stefan, because I'd love to get your take on the trip and hear from you some things that maybe some of our viewers and listeners have not been able to sort of see or perceive from the reporting. You actually had a commentary um, for Deutschlandfunk after the trip, and you titled it Nichts wird gut. Nothing is okay. Nothing will be good. That's not sort of a very positive take on the trip. Can you share with us why you are so concerned following Scholz's trip to Washington?
Yeah, of course, whoever was in Washington in these 24 hours, it was nearly 24 hours, Olaf Scholz and his delegations and we as journalists spent in Washington. And these were, of course, dramatic 24 hours. It was the day when we had the news about the oral arguments in the Supreme Court about the Colorado case. We had the publication of Robert Hur's report on Joe Biden with these toxic remarks on his mental health. And then we had the events on Senate. And while during Olaf Scholz's dinner with members of Senate, Biden gave this extremely unlucky press conferences in which he confused Sisi with the Mexican president. So it was dramatic, and I think that you guys in the United States sense the importance of these events as a culmination of the problems in American politics and I'd say in American democracy. You sense it much way more than most people did it, at least in these moments in Germany. So my commentary on Saturday when I came back was meant to be some kind of a wake-up call for the Germans to explain them, and I'm not the only one doing this, what is going on in Germany. And of course, the general sense was that during this visit in which Olaf Scholz, from an American perspective, was rather a marginal figure, that these 24 hours on one side gave us a sense of how a Trump presidency could look like, a withdrawal of the United States from Europe, from the Ukrainian battlefield. And of course, it reminded us of the major problem in Joseph Biden's campaign, which is his age. And so in my commentary, the headline indeed was nichts ist gut, nothing is good. In the text, it said nothing will be good in a sense that America will care for Germany's and Europe's safety and for Europe's and Germany's well-being at America as we were used to. And this, of course, is in the political arena not a very new thing to realize. Angela Merkel said it in 2017. We have to be aware that we have to take more responsibility for ourselves. So this is this, of course, is a major topic in the German in the European discourse. But this visit of Olaf Scholz, of course, reminded us of the urgency of this issue.
I mean, I think, one of the things that you pointed out in your piece and that you just touched on is sort of the jockeying for power that we're seeing in the US and different forces at play, but also some of the fundamental weaknesses in both candidates, but particularly in the candidacy of Biden. And this all is happening against the backdrop of, I think it's fair to say, real concern in Germany and across Europe about what a second Trump presidency might look like. So these are all themes that really kind of came together, making it sort of an intense moment while you were there. But what was the mood? And it was interesting in your piece, and you just said it too, that it's almost as if uh, Olaf Scholz, even though he's the Chancellor of Germany, was a marginalized figure or character in all of this, right? An observer of what was going on. Yet I'd love to hear from you what you felt the mood was like between Biden and Scholz, because it seemed to me that they got along, but they also seemed alone, given the political challenges that each of them faces at home.
Yes, both are a president and a chancellor, which face serious problems with their popularity. Joe Biden, I believe, has much more arguments on his side to point on successes of his politics when it comes to economics, to the labor market. Don't forget that Olaf Scholz is a chancellor that has a very difficult coalition he is governing with, and he's facing new problems within the mechanics of his coalition with every day, and he is a chancellor governing without money. They passed a budget at the end of the year, but they are in serious financial troubles, which is when it comes to the need to step in for America, to take more responsibility when it comes to security, to military issues, which makes it much more difficult. And we are seeing this in the coalition, in the German coalition, every day now. And you were asking how the mood was. It was interesting to see what a journey it was in this personal relation between Olaf Scholz and the US president since Olaf Scholz's first visit as the German chancellor in the White House in February 22. And I was on this trip as well. And I remember how stunned everybody was. Remember, it was a few days before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and we were still discussing how Germany would react with regard to the Nord Stream pipeline. And we saw a German chancellor standing in the White House next to the US president, and the chancellor not being able or not willing to say the word Nord Stream. Everybody, the US journalists, were asking him, what will you do if Putin invades? Will you stop the Nord Stream project? And Olaf Scholz, in his typical way, was evading a concrete answer to this question, which was really amazing for us to see. And we saw Joe Biden standing next to him, saying, well, if this happens, we will stop it. Believe me. I don't know the exact words, but it was really a US president telling the chancellor, if you don't do it, I will do it, believe me, and I know how to do it. So this was the beginning of their personal relationship. And in these first weeks and months, in a very difficult relationship, when I believe many of his foreign partners, particularly in the US, were irritated, asking questions about this new German chancellor. What a guy is this? Because it's easy. It's not easy to understand Scholz. He isn't very precise in his rhetoric, and I think that's not only on stage. It's also in personal conversations. And I think these were weeks and months when Annalena Baerbock, as a foreign minister, played an important role, because she, by her personality and her biography, was able to kind of impersonate the values of the classic values of the transatlantic partnership, and she immediately built up obviously a very good relationship, personal relationship with Tony Blinken, quite contrary to Scholz. But then there was a movement. There were developments in the relationship between Scholz and Biden, and a very important moment was the op-ed, the text Biden published in the New York Times in, I think it was late May or June 22, when he defined the limits of US support for Ukraine. It was, among them was the idea, we won't support them with weapons that allow Ukraine to attack Russia. And that was obviously in accordance with Olaf Scholz's approach to the issue. And ever since, Scholz again and again quoted this article of Biden and convincingly explained that he was in complete accordance with Biden, more than it appeared, more than it was obvious. And I think on this visit, indeed, we saw two leaders which are in good terms when it comes to this. And they also, I mean, we spoke about Ukraine. The second important topic on the agenda, of course, was Israel, the Middle East, Gaza. And here as well, they have a lot in common, both being politicians, Biden more from his personal perspective, Olaf Scholz, we spoke about that in December in New York, from the approach of German tradition and German Staatsräson, with an approach very loyal to Israel, but both torn between this loyalty to Israel and the facts the Netanyahu government is creating on the ground in Gaza. And I think we see both of them being more and more openly critical with Netanyahu and distance to the Israeli approach. So this is also something which they seem to have in common.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to maybe tie a couple of threads together, because I certainly remember the images of Olaf Scholz and Biden standing next to each other, and wishing that Scholz was showing more leadership when it came to Nord Stream and not letting Nord Stream go into use if Putin were to do anything in Ukraine. And I keep looking for those sort of opportunities for leadership coming from Berlin. It seemed to me that Scholz was traveling to Washington with some wind in his sails, because his visit came on the heels of the EU Council approving a pretty substantial package of about 50 billion euro for Ukraine by 2027, as a way of maybe trying to cajole Washington into stepping up the financial support for Ukraine. Did you feel that Scholz was showing leadership while he was in Washington?
Well, I think in this particular visit, it was not that much about showing leadership. Scholz claims, of course, that he showed leadership in the weeks before. particularly when it comes to the EU compromise or the solution we saw in the European Union. And some of you might remember the picture of Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, and Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, sitting with Viktor Orban right before the special summit of the European Council at the end of the last week. No, not last week, a week before Scholz's visit to US. So, and we heard that indeed they had with Viktor Orban, Scholz played a crucial role, and so he had good reasons to claim that he, and particularly, of course, in Germany, since the Zeitenwende, and on a European level, that they were able to show leadership, and of course, a leadership we were missing in the United States.
So let me bring in a viewer question. You know, a little bit earlier, you said that you thought that Biden had more successes under his belt than Scholz has had. And one of our viewers is curious what you would consider some of those successes by Biden.
Well, of course, you're much more qualified to judge Biden's successes, but understand that at least Biden claims that he has a lot of success and a lot of achievements in his presidency that he can present in the upcoming campaign, whereas Olaf Scholz is really faced with a list of problems that is so long and growing that I see him really in trouble when it comes to a next German election, whenever that will be. Will it be in 25 or will it be an earlier election? I believe personally it will be a regular election in 25, but I told you right before the meeting started, Steve, that until summer, I was pretty convinced that Olaf Scholz has a very good chance to win the next election, particularly when it comes to comparing him to the opposition leader Friedrich Merz. But since the summer, this changed, and Olaf Scholz knows it. It was the summer when they promised that it would be a break and that the coalition would function in a much smoother way than it did before, and they didn't keep the promise. They are confronted with their internal frictions and problems all the time. And what has changed is that until summer, Scholz tried to present himself in a Merkel style, like a president in a presidential style, standing high above the frictions and the problems on the level of the political parties in the coalition. And since summer, since this disappointment that they didn't reach that degree of consensus and that operational professionality they had promised, since summer, Scholz and the Chancellor's office is blamed for these problems. So it's a personal matter for Scholz now and for his chief of staff, Wolfgang Schmidt, who should be the one coordinating politics. And again, we saw, like 2 weeks ago in the budget debate in the parliament, we saw the vice chancellor Robert Habeck surprising everyone, and obviously also the chancellor with the proposal of implementing another special budget for economic relief. Nobody knew about it. The liberals, Christian Lindner, immediately made it clear that this was not a consensus in the coalition, and of course, Scholz is blamed for this new debate. And this is just one example of these frictions in the coalition.
So let's stick with that for a minute before we come back to the trip to Washington and maybe a couple of other foreign policy questions, because indeed there's a lot of foreign policy making going on right now. As you say, this is sort of an important moment, an important juncture for Chancellor Scholz and indeed for the governing coalition. It seemed as if a week ago there was a huge sigh of relief when the Bundestag passed its budget for 2024. I had the opportunity to speak with a member of the Bundestag who sits on the budget committee last week and asked him, what this budget tells us about the government's priorities moving forward. And it certainly seemed as if the government is strapped for cash, as you say, that there just isn't the money to do everything that this government has said it wants to do. How do you think the traffic light coalition moves forward, and do you think that there will continue to be real tensions between the parties?
There are real tensions, and this government, you shouldn't forget that this government was not prepared to govern under this pressure, under this financial pressure. I mean, everybody knew that with the end of Angela Merkel's term, the pockets were empty. There was no money left, and everybody knew the financial situation was very difficult, but they were not ready or the design of this coalition is not made for this pressure. It is seeing now, it is facing now, and
it's certainly not a crisis government, put it that way, right? It's not
I mean, the crisis, of course, the crisis for nearly 2 years now helped them to stay together, and particularly was helpful for the leadership of the coalition to force their parliamentary caucuses in the lines. But this is becoming harder and harder. And what we are seeing now, these frictions, these open frictions in the coalition, also have to do with the growing dissatisfaction in the parliamentary groups of the parties, and particularly within the Social Democrats and the Green Party. These groups, these parliamentary caucuses, have changed enormously. The Green Party has nearly doubled the size of their members of parliament. Many of them are young, very young politicians. Many of them not with a long experience in party politics or state or local parliaments, but many of them coming more from the activist movement, from the ecology movement or so on. So they were not used to compromising, and of course, not to governing or to supporting a government in the parliament. And it's similar in the Social Democratic Party and their parliamentary group. So they are tired of compromising. They are longing for identity. They are longing for successes for success, which they simply didn't see enough and won't see enough in the coming 2 years.
So related to that and to the sort of budget crisis that we find ourselves in, but also against the backdrop of this comment that I think shocked a lot of people that Donald Trump made, and it sort of sets the stage for next weekend's Munich Security Conference. But he basically said that that if he were reelected as president, that the United States would not come to the aid of any NATO member state that was not meeting its financial obligations, and even almost sort of encouraging Russia to do whatever it wants to do. And that sent shockwaves through a lot of people in here in Germany, and across Europe. One of our viewers asks, in light of this special budget that was proposed, um, and in light of the statement from Donald Trump, do you think that there might be a second Sondervermögen for defense? And what other ways are there to finance the German Bundeswehr, the German military? What else might the government be considering at this point?
Well, if we are speaking about another special fund, we won't speak for a while about another special fund for the Bundeswehr because they weren't able to use the fund they created with the beginning of the war. Now we are speaking of that was Robert Habeck's proposal about a special fund to support the industry and to support the energy transformation, because this is what was harmed most by the budget problems. And you know that the budget problems were created by a decision of the German Supreme Court of the Bundesverfassungsgericht last year that declared the former budget as unconstitutional. So that created the need to pass a new budget, which they now did. The Bundeswehr, that's at the moment, for the time being, from my impression, not that much a funding problem. It's an organizational problem. It's about creating fast ways to produce weapons, to produce ammunition. Scholz and the German defense minister this morning participated in the opening ceremony for an ammunition factory in Germany, something I think few people would have thought possible, that a social democratic chancellor travels to Niedersachsen and cuts the ribbon in the opening ceremony for a weapons manufactory. But that's what's happening now, and that's the challenge on the European level, to keep the promise the EU gave to Ukraine to deliver that amount of rounds they promised to deliver. And this is still an industry which is so much under the protection of national governments. It's unbelievable what we have learned about national protectionism in the defense industry. For example, when they started delivering tanks, German tanks, the Leopard tanks and the Gepard tanks to Ukraine, and needed to gather ammunition for these tanks, only then we learned that Germany had delivered these tanks to all kinds of European partners, but that all these European partners had taken care that their tanks can only use ammunition of their national producers. So Portuguese Leopard tanks don't work with German or French Leopard ammunition. So this is something Europe really has to work on, and this is one of the big challenges. Now they are trying, for example, they are trying to somehow to find ways to fulfill the obligation of delivering these amounts of ammunition to Ukraine. And I just this afternoon spoke to a member of the European Parliament who said we have to find a way that we don't rely on the European national industries. We have to make public calls, and the European Union has to buy this ammunition like they during the COVID pandemic bought in a centralized procedure the vaccines, and they have to be free to buy, if possible, ammunition in, be it Taiwan, be it the US.
Well, so Stefan, let me add to that because the other thing that's going on right now, of course, is the meeting of the countries that make up the Weimar Triangle, or Germany and its neighbors, France and Poland. And they are certainly sending signals of standing shoulder to shoulder. As a matter of fact, the relatively new Polish leader, or new again Polish leader, Donald Tusk, um, basically said one for all and all for one, and it seems clear that these three EU member states are trying to find greater unity, greater common ground when it comes to defense. And I think that has to be driven by the war in Ukraine, but probably also, at least in part, by this statement from Trump that this is, your piece was a wake-up call, but that this is kind of also a wake-up call for people to recognize that Europe needs to take on more responsibility when it comes to these issues around defense.
Yeah, and it's hard to overestimate the importance of the election and the change of the Polish government. I mean, this, of course, is something which really which is a booster for European cooperation, and that's what we are seeing while we are speaking. I think while we are speaking, there is a press conference, or it should have just ended. I missed it. I will have to watch it after our conversation. A press conference of Donald Tusk, the new Polish Prime Minister, and Olaf Scholz, who was here. We saw the meetings of the foreign ministers of the three countries in Paris, and this, of course, allows a lot of expectations and hope with regard to their cooperation. And I think it will be very important. I think that's on their agenda, that they have to find ways to reach out to UK and to intensify the cooperation with the United Kingdom. This will be, I think, one of the next points in the European agenda.
Mm-hmm. So I have two questions about NATO. One of them from someone in the United States asking about German perceptions, and one from a German asking about US perceptions. The American is curious what your sense is, or if you have any data on the number of Germans, or the percentage of Germans who see NATO and the US as being a danger or a risk, rather than seeing Russia and Putin as a risk.
I can't give you any data. It's an interesting question. I should have it. I will have to look it up. It's homework to do. Thanks for that. But
Okay.
my impression is it's not a big issue compared to what it was in the, let's say, in the 80s or so, when we had these mass demonstrations in West Germany. I think there is a general sympathy for Germany being in the NATO. There is a growing awareness of the importance of the American security guarantees for Europe. But of course, we see what I would call a special situation in East Germany with the AfD party, with the right-wing party, and they are catering to all kind of anti-American emotions, and in a similar way, the left party is also the new left party founded by Sarah Wagenknecht from the traditional left party. They just, most of you will have heard that they just had a split in the party. So we are seeing a lot of dynamics in these fringe parties on the right and on the extreme right and on the extreme left wing, and anti-Americanism will continue to be an issue in this field of politics, and this mainly concerns East Germany. But and of course, we should remember that we have important elections coming up in East Germany, in Saxonia, Thuringia, and in Brandenburg in September.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that people in the U.S. hear about is Russlandversteher, or Russia sympathizers in Germany, and they find that hard to understand. And I mean, I also don't have any data, but I would say that the majority of people in Germany do believe in NATO and membership in NATO, and are appalled by what Putin is doing in Ukraine. But of course, there are some exceptions to that. But coming back to
give you a practical an example from my daily experience in Deutschlandradio and the German National Public Radio. We are always trying to monitor the diversity of the positions we have within our editorial team, because we are obliged to be diverse as a public broadcaster in Germany. And ever since Russia's attack on Ukraine, we have to face that we are not very diverse, that we are not able to represent the positions being critical about the German and the American support for Ukraine in our own editorial team. So what we do is we reach out to people from without our station to be guests, to write guest commentaries or so in our station, taking more critical positions of weapons delivery or so.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes perfect sense. Let me come back to this other viewer question about NATO from a German. We did talk a little bit about this statement that Trump made about NATO over the weekend, and the viewer is curious, especially after your visit to Washington last week, whether you think that traditional Republican members of Congress would allow Trump to actually implement this strategy that he outlined, which the viewer says basically amounts to blackmailing, or whether they would maybe threaten to cut funding for some of President Trump's favorite projects. What's your sense of how firmly behind this thought are those Republican members of Congress?
Well, I think some of you might be much more competent to answer that question than I'm from Germany. But I just can tell you what I see as the reflections from German politicians and German people being involved with U.S. politics, and they are still really shocked by the degree they see the Republican Party being under the influence of Trump, and they still have. I mean, when you look at the Christian Democratic Party, they had so close relations to the Republican Party. I spoke to people in think tanks and tried to find out, does anybody have connections to institutions like the Heritage Foundation or so? So just to give us an impression of what is being planned and thought within these circles, and it's very hard to find people that claim to have an insight into what's going on in the inner circles of the Republican Party. And so I think generally the foreign policy establishment in Germany would say, well, Trump is not able to decree that the United States are leaving NATO, but they know it's about funding, it's about the presence of troops.
So let's come back to the trip to Washington and the priorities. I mean, we talked a little bit about Ukraine being at the top of the agenda, and then of course also the situation in Gaza. But there were other issues that were discussed as well. I think the economy played a role, some discussion about the Inflation Reduction Act and subsidies. Energy and LNG was another topic that came up, and certainly relations with China, and also the challenge of AI. Are there any sort of readouts that you can give us on any of these subjects that would help our understanding of where Biden and Scholz either had sort of alignment or whether they really had divergence and where we need to watch what's going on between Washington and Berlin?
Well, I mean, of course, we have seen since a long time being particularly the Inflation Reduction Act being a major issue in all the discussions we are having. And I think that this didn't play a major role in this visit. I think the German politics is much more relying on the influence they have on in through the channels uh, of German companies doing trade in the United States. I think they are reaching out a lot to governors in the United States, in states where German companies are present, to find ways to underline the problems Germany has with this legislation. I think one of the things Olaf Scholz was trying to explain or was trying to underline was in general the importance he sees in free trade agreements. So he's very worried about what's going on with the Mercosur trade agreement between the European Union and the Southern American states. Scholz, as a former mayor of Hamburg and a liberal social democrat, is a strong advocate of free trade and free trade agreements, and he's using every opportunity to promote whatever serves free trade. And I think this is a standard, standard texts in the conversations he has in the Oval Office, and he has also within the European Union.
So as we come to a close, I'd like to ask you two closing questions, sort of riffing off of questions that have been posed by some of our viewers. One of them has to do with the trip and your commentary piece, and the other has to do with sort of the German political landscape, and I'll come to that in just a moment. We started by talking a little bit about your piece, Nichts wird gut, nothing will be good, and that you wrote that as a sort of wake-up call for Germany to recognize what was going on in the United States and how Germany needs to prepare for some of those developments. One of our viewers said that Germany has not woken up, and that time and time again, Germany has not woken up and has not paid up. And I guess the question I have for you is, what do you think it will take for Germany to wake up and to hear the kinds of concerns that you outlined in your piece and recognize that the environment is changing?
Yeah, the question would be is what is being woken up in this sense? What is it? What degree of awareness do we have to reach? And of course, we have different layers that have to deal with the issues. And when it comes to, I think that we have a pretty general consensus when it comes to the leadership of of this government, and we could also see other coalitions, particularly when it comes to the Christian Democratic Party, that are very aware of what's necessary to do. But as I described, this is a long way to go, and I fear that for example, when I look deeply into the constituencies of the governing parties, and this does not only address and I don't only look at the Green Party and the Social Democrats, also the Liberals. I fear they need some more shockwaves really to wake up and to adjust their agendas. But from now on, we will see political parties on all levels practically permanently under the impression of important elections. I mean, it's the EU election, the European election in summer or late spring. And then, as this ends, we will have these very important elections in Eastern Germany. And these elections might send out other kinds of shockwaves into the German political system. I mean, we will see situations in Saxonia and Thuringia with the right-wing extremists being the strongest parties in the parliaments there. And we are discussing even the possibility that in Saxonia or in Thuringia, when it comes to certain to certain developments, when the smaller parties are not strong enough and many votes are not being counted because some of these smaller parties, it could be the Social Democrats, it could be these new or the old left-wing parties, when they miss the 5%, the 5% hurdle you have to pass to be a member to be represented in the parliaments. When they end up with 4.99%, 2-3 of these parties, there might be situations when the right-wing extremists, the AfD, with 37-38% of the votes, has an absolute majority in the parliament and can govern. This will completely shake the political landscape and with a shockwave we have rarely seen in German politics. This will happen in September, and when this is over, maybe with a long phase of very difficult formation of coalitions in these states, that might be the beginning of 25, the year of elections on national level. So this will all influence the political parties, and these elections in fall, they will be really, really important. And also when it comes to the Christian Democrats, who are of course the party that is most in this sense vogue when it comes to defense issues and transatlantic relations and so on. They will be in an extremely difficult situation because it's foreseeable that the Christian Democrats in Thuringia, in Saxonia, will be in a situation where their leadership has to convince the parties on state level that they can form any coalition or any cooperation with the right-wing extremists and rather have a coalition or being tolerated by the former communists. And you can imagine how difficult this will be for the Christian Democrats, and this will influence the complete range of political issues.
Well, and so this is really kind of the closing thought, because the last question I wanted to ask you about has to do with the fragmentation of the party system in Germany and the increasing number of parties, right? You talked about the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which has sort of decimated the left party. There's also the Werteunion, around Georg Maaßen. There's this new party, the Democratic Alliance for Diversity and Awakening, which is a Turkish-oriented party. A number of political parties seem to be springing up, and there's real concern that this might further fragment the system, but also make it much more difficult to build coalitions in the future. And so, how do you see this developing? What are some of your concerns around that beyond what you've already shared with us?
Yeah, I'm prepared to see very, very problematic times and challenges coming up. I mean, it can also turn out to be different. We might also see in these elections in East Germany completely different results. We might see the possibility that we have coalitions between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats and the Greens or so, and that will lift a heavy burden from their shoulders. But we might see the political systems in Germany and in the US under a lot of pressure in the foreseeable times, and this is worrying. Like the former president of the German Supreme Court, Andreas Voskuhle, recently said in an interview, it's not granted that the age of liberal democracies in the Western Hemisphere will be a long age. We might be in a process where liberal democracies come to an end in the way we have seen it.
Yeah.
This is not very optimistic, but this is something which we have to face when we are realistic. This is what it's about.
Exactly. I mean, it is not an optimistic way to end our conversation today, but I think it is an important thing for viewers and for listeners to take with them as we think about the political landscape and where we are, given how many elections are and will be taking place this year, and that it really is democracy that is on the ballot as well.
Yeah, Stephen, and we spoke about it in New York. I think it will be really important to have these kinds of dialogues and this kind of learning from each other. And I really do hope that we stay in touch. We have a lot to learn, and even for me, it was interesting on this trip even for this short time, and even after having been in the United States for a while, in the last year and the beginning of this year, it was so interesting to see the developments from this other perspective and to transport it to Germany. So this dialogue is really, really important.
Well, and I want to thank you so much for having the conversation with us, for staying in dialogue and for continuing that. And I look forward to further exchanges. I do think that this is as you said, it's an important juncture for the German Chancellor and for his coalition government, but it is an important period for all of us, and for the democracies that we live in. So I would like to thank you very much, Stephan, for taking time on a Monday evening when you should have been drinking a gin and tonic, to have this conversation with us.
So thank you. See you in Munich, and thanks to all our listeners. Greetings to the US.